There are moments in life that arrive disguised as mistakes. A wrong turn, a misdialed number, a door opened in error. Claire Bennett thought she was climbing into a rideshare on a rainy Thursday night in Chicago. She was wrong. The man behind the wheel wasn't a driver. He was Julian Harper, the CEO whose name was etched into the glass tower where she filed reports on the fourth floor. And that one mistake, that single moment of confusion in the rain, would change everything about the night ahead. It had been one of those days that stretches time like taffy. End of quarter reporting meant everyone on the analytics floor stayed late, hunched over spreadsheets and projections, watching the clock tick past 7, then 8, then 9. Claire's eyes burned from screen glare. Her back ached from hours in a chair that had never quite fit right. When she finally saved her last file and shut down her computer, the office was nearly empty. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of the cleaning crew making their rounds. Outside, the rain had started. Not the gentle mist that Chicago does so well, but the kind of downpour that turns streets into rivers and makes you regret every choice that led you to this moment. Claire stood under the narrow awning of the building entrance, watching the app on her phone cycle through that maddening loading screen. Around her, other late workers huddled with their phones raised like talismans, all of them trying to summon cars that didn't exist. When she saw the black sedan pull up to the curb, she didn't think. She just moved. It was instinct, the desperate instinct of someone who wanted nothing more than to be home, dry, and away from this day. She yanked open the passenger door and dropped into the seat, breathless and grateful. The door closed with that solid, expensive sound that only luxury cars make. And then the man in the driver's seat turned around. Julian Harper. She recognized him instantly, though she'd only ever seen him in company-wide emails and the occasional glimpse across a crowded lobby. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket. His white shirt had the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and there was a tiredness in his face that money couldn't fix. For 3 full seconds, neither of them spoke. Claire's hand found the door handle, her heart hammered against her ribs, and then his voice cut through the silence. Calm, measured, almost amused. "Your car hasn't arrived yet. Stay." The rain drummed on the roof. Claire's mind raced through 100 explanations, 100 apologies, all of them inadequate. She was sitting in her CEO's car, not her direct supervisor, not someone she'd ever spoken to. The man whose name was literally on the building, Julian Reed Harper, founder and CEO of Harper Global, a company that had offices in 9 cities and revenue streams she couldn't begin to understand. She tried to speak, but her throat had gone dry. "I'm so sorry," she finally managed, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "I thought this was my ride. I'll get out right now." But Julian just glanced at his phone on the dashboard, the rideshare app idle, no route selected, and looked back at her with those unreadable eyes. "It's pouring. Your app probably crashed. Everyone's trying to get a car right now." He wasn't wrong. Claire pulled out her phone. The rideshare app was frozen on a loading screen that mocked her with its endlessly spinning wheel. The humiliation settled over her like a wet coat. She refreshed the app once, twice, 3 times. Each time it came back with the same message: no drivers available in your area. She could feel heat rising to her face. "I'll just wait outside," she said, reaching again for the door handle. But Julian's voice stopped her. "You'll be soaked in 30 seconds. Just sit. Try the app again in a few minutes." It wasn't a suggestion. It was that particular kind of command that people with power learn to disguise as courtesy. So she sat. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Claire gripped her bag in her lap like a shield, hyper-aware of every breath, every small movement. The car smelled like leather and something else, something expensive she couldn't name. Cedar, maybe, or sandalwood. Julian kept his hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead through the rain-blurred windshield. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Long day?" Claire blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected. "Yeah, end of quarter reporting. Everyone stays late." He nodded once, understanding in a way that surprised her. Minutes crawled by. Claire checked her app again and again, watching it fail to load, crash, reload, fail again. She felt trapped, not by him, but by the situation, by the weather, by her own spectacularly bad luck. The pressure of the silence became unbearable. "Do you usually drive yourself?" she heard herself ask, immediately regretting it. Julian didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice carried something she hadn't heard before, something almost vulnerable. Sometimes, when I need to think. Claire nodded, not knowing what else to do. She stared at the dashboard, counting seconds, wishing she could dissolve into the leather seats. Then Julian shifted. He checked his watch, simple, elegant, no diamonds or logos, and turned to look at her. There was something calculating in his eyes now, something that made her pulse quicken for reasons she didn't understand. "Can I ask you something?" Her stomach tightened. "Sure." And then came the words that would rewrite the entire night. "Do you have plans tonight?" Claire's mind stuttered. Was he asking her out? That was impossible. She was nobody, a mid-level analyst who could barely afford her rent. He was Julian Harper. She must have misunderstood. "I was just going home," she said carefully. "Why?" Julian turned his body toward her, one arm resting on the steering wheel. His tone stayed calm, but there was urgency underneath it, coiled and barely contained. "I need a favor, a big one, and I'll pay you for it." The air seemed to leave the car. "I need you to pretend to be my girlfriend, just for tonight, a few hours, that's it." The words hung in the air between them like something physical. Claire stared at him, certain she'd heard wrong, waiting for him to laugh, to tell her it was some kind of bizarre joke. But Julian didn't laugh. He just watched her with those cold, sharp eyes, completely serious. "Are you serious?" she whispered. He nodded, completely, and then he told her why. His mother and a business partner had set up a dinner, a setup in the most traditional sense. They wanted him to meet someone appropriate, someone from the right circles, someone who fit the narrative they'd written for his life. Julian had been avoiding it for months, but tonight there were no more excuses. If he showed up alone, they'd just keep pushing. If he showed up with someone, they might finally back off. And that's where Claire came in. $20,000, that's what he offered, transferred to her account before they even left the parking lot. No contracts, no strings, just one night of pretending.
Claire should have said no. Every rational part of her brain screamed at her to refuse, to get out of the car, to go home and forget this ever happened. But then she looked at the number on her phone. $20,000. That was 6 months of rent. That was her student loans. That was breathing room she hadn't had in years. So she heard herself say yes, and just like that, she stopped being Claire Bennett, anonymous analyst from the 4th floor. She became someone else entirely. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't have prices on the menu, the kind where the staff moved like ghosts and everyone spoke in hushed tones that suggested important things happening at every table. Julian's hand found the small of Claire's back as they walked through the main dining room, a touch that was gentle but possessive, the kind of gesture that said, "She's with me," without words. And then they reached the private room. Eleanor Harper sat at the head of the table like a queen holding court, 65 and immaculate, with silver hair styled in a way that probably cost more than Claire's monthly salary. Next to her was Douglas Carmichael, the business partner, broad-shouldered and calculating, the kind of man who measured people the way others measured investments. And across from them sat Victoria, beautiful Victoria, with her perfect posture and her designer dress and her smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The introductions were brief and cold. Eleanor's eyes swept over Claire like a scanner detecting counterfeit currency. Douglas barely looked at her. Victoria's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "How did you two meet?" Eleanor asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer would be insufficient. Julian lied smoothly. "A mutual friends event 3 months ago." The conversation moved forward like a train on damaged tracks, jolting, uncomfortable, barely held together. They asked Claire questions the way interrogators do: where she went to school, what her family did, where she grew up. Each answer seemed to disappoint them in new and creative ways. State university, middle-class suburb, father was a contractor, mother was a teacher. Nothing impressive, nothing connected, nothing that mattered in their world. Victoria watched with barely concealed amusement, like someone watching a nature documentary about a particularly clumsy animal. 20 minutes in, Claire excused herself to the restroom. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to remember how to breathe. She stood in the bathroom, hands gripping the marble counter, staring at herself in the mirror. What was she doing here? These people looked at her like she was something they'd scraped off their shoes. And Julian, he'd barely said a word in her defense. He just sat there, letting them dissect her piece by piece. She should leave, take the money and go. The deal was to show up, and she'd shown up. But as she stood there, something shifted inside her. A small, quiet rebellion that started in her chest and spread outward like heat. She thought about every time someone had made her feel small, every time someone had dismissed her because she didn't have the right credentials or the right connections, every time she'd swallowed her words to keep the peace, and she decided, right there in that bathroom, that she was done swallowing. When Claire walked back into that room, she wasn't the same woman who had left it. Her shoulders were back, her chin was up. She didn't sit down. She stood at the edge of the table and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady, clear, louder than it had been all night. "I want to say something, and I need you all to actually listen." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. Douglas leaned back in his chair. Victoria's smile finally faded. "I know what you think of me. I've known since the moment I walked in here. I don't have the right education, or the right last name, or the right anything. I'm not from your world, and I never will be. But here's what you don't seem to understand. I don't need to be. I'm not here because I'm trying to climb some social ladder, or because I want access to your money or your connections, or whatever else you think I'm after. I'm here because Julian asked me to be, and I said yes. That's it." The room was absolutely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Claire kept going, the words spilling out now, unstoppable. "You can think whatever you want about me. You can decide I'm ordinary or temporary or whatever makes you feel better. But I'm not going to stand here and let you treat me like I'm less than human just because I don't come from your world. If I'm here as a person who has value, not as a prop, not as a face. And if that's not acceptable to you, then I'll leave. But I'm not going to apologize for who I am."
For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. And then Julian stood up. The sound of his chair scraping the floor cut through the silence like a gunshot. He looked at his mother, then at Douglas, then at Victoria. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath it, the kind of strength that doesn't need volume to command attention. "She's right. All of you have been rude and condescending since the moment we walked in, and I sat here and let it happen because I thought keeping the peace was more important. I was wrong." Eleanor's face went pale. Douglas started to protest, but Julian wasn't finished. He told them he was done. Done with the setups, done with the pressure, done with pretending their approval mattered more than basic human decency. He told them that Claire was worth 10 of everyone in that room combined, including himself. And then he apologized to her. Right there in front of all of them, he looked at Claire and said he should have defended her from the start. The dinner was over. They walked out together. The drive across Chicago was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not uncomfortable, not tense, something closer to understanding. Claire gave Julian her address, a neighborhood where the buildings were older and the rent was cheaper, where streetlights flickered and corner stores stayed open late. He didn't comment, he just drove. Halfway there, Claire spoke into the darkness. "You didn't have to do that, stand up for me. You could have just let me leave." Julian kept his eyes on the road. "I know, but I wanted to. Not because of our agreement, because it was the right thing to do." When they reached her building, Julian put the car in park but didn't turn off the engine. Claire reached for the door handle, then stopped. She looked at him one more time. "Thank you. For the money, for tonight, even the bad parts." Julian nodded. "You earned it more than you know." She stepped out onto the sidewalk. The rain had stopped. The air was cool and clean. Behind her, she heard the window roll down. Julian's voice called out, "Claire!" She turned around.
He was leaning toward the passenger window, his expression softer than she'd seen it all night. "If you ever need anything, not money, just anything, you have my number now. Use it." Claire didn't know if he meant it, but she nodded anyway. The window rolled back up. She watched as he pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the flow of traffic, his car becoming just another set of tail lights in the vast machinery of the city. Claire stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, just breathing. Then she walked inside and climbed the stairs to her apartment. Everything was exactly as she'd left it that morning. The bills on the counter, the cracked ceiling, the furniture she'd bought piece by piece from thrift stores and estate sales. But something felt different. She felt different. She sat down on her couch and pulled out her phone. The banking app still showed $20,000. It was real. All of it had been real. She thought about the look on Victoria's face when she'd walked back into that room. She thought about Eleanor's shock. She thought about Julian standing up and saying she was worth 10 of everyone there. She didn't have a boyfriend. She didn't have a contract. She didn't have anything she hadn't had that morning, except for one thing. She had walked into a room full of people who wanted to make her feel small, and she had refused. She had stood up and said no. Not with anger, not with bitterness, just with the simple truth of who she was. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Across the city, Julian drove through empty streets, his hand steady on the wheel, his mind quiet for the first time in years. He thought about the way Claire had stood there and refused to be diminished, the way she'd spoken like someone who knew her own worth, even when everyone in the room was telling her otherwise. He'd spent 15 years building an empire, measuring his life in deals and acquisitions and strategic moves, building something that looked impressive from the outside, but felt hollow from within. And in one night, a stranger had reminded him of something he'd forgotten, that power means nothing if you trade honesty to keep it. Julian didn't have answers. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow or next week or next year. But for the first time in a very long time, he was asking the questions that mattered. And that felt like a start. Sometimes the wrong car takes you exactly where you need to go. Sometimes a mistake is just the universe giving you permission to change direction. Sometimes the people who seem the most different from us are the ones who remind us who we really are. That night, two strangers sat in their separate corners of the city, both of them changed by a chance encounter in the rain. Claire Bennett, who learned that her voice mattered even in rooms that didn't want to hear it, and Julian Harper, who remembered that being powerful means nothing if you're not willing to use that power for something true. They would never forget that rainy Thursday night, the night everything changed, the night they both found something they didn't know they were looking for. The night that started with a wrong car and ended with the right choice. And somewhere in the complicated mathematics of fate and coincidence and pure dumb luck, two lives intersected for just a few hours. It wasn't a love story. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real. It was honest. It was two people choosing to be brave when it would have been easier to stay small. And in a world that often feels designed to diminish us, sometimes that's the most radical thing we can do. Sometimes getting into the wrong car is exactly right. Sometimes the best journeys are the ones we never planned to take. And sometimes, just sometimes, a single night can remind us who we really are.
For more videos, please subscribe, like, and comment. At Whispering Lens, every story whispers. Every whisper speaks to the soul. Please like, hit subscribe, and turn on the notification bell.